Good morning. Again, I'm Christy Coleman, Executive Director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. We're delighted that you all are here for this morning's Fireside chat. This particular discussion is about reaching diverse and underserved audiences. And joining me in the conversation, first up is Dr. Ashley Jordan. And she joined the African American Museum of Philadelphia as president and CEO in 2021. She most recently after that, or before that, she served as Senior Director of Development for the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio. Next to her is Marvin-Alonzo Greer. He serves as Director of Historic Interpretation and Community Engagement for the Department of Parks and Planning in Prince George's County, Maryland. Yeah, I know, right? His flagship project is the curation of the Sankofa Mobile Museum. And then, last but certainly not least, is Dr. Noelle Trent. She is the president and CEO of the Museum of African American History, Boston and Nantucket. And she combines her passion for history with professional expertise to craft empowering experiences about Black history and more. So again, please join me in welcoming the panelists as we talk about reaching diverse and underserved audiences. Now, I have to start by saying, when we were doing our prep conversations for this panel, there were some really impactful stories, because each of us, the four of us that are sitting in front of you, have been involved in very diverse communities and cities around the country in our work. And we each had stories of exclusion for the communities that we were trying to serve, and how we reached out in different ways to bring those communities to us. And what was interesting that I think we all shared is the fact that the experiences for people, the experiences for communities of color, or communities that are non-dominant, i.e. perhaps the LGBTQI communities and things like that, is that our spaces, our museums, our cultural institutions, even our governments in some cases, have not always been welcoming. And so in many cases, these communities create activities of their own because they haven't been either invited in or been participating. So there are traditions and things that are happening within the community that the dominant culture may know nothing about. And so, as was just suggested, this idea that somehow one particular idea has to be the dominant one is a little problematic when you're trying to reach communities of color or difference. Okay, that's sort of our starting point. And I'll give you a perfect example. When many of you may or may not know, I grew up in Williamsburg, so all of this was all around me all the time, right? But the actual visiting and engagement of that, even though I grew up in this community, I ended up having to work here before I ever learned that on the eve of the American Revolution, 52% of Williamsburg were Black people. And I lived here, right? So what that does inadvertently is it says that your story, your experience of your ancestors is not important, and therefore they are not even considered a part of the founding generations. Every summer, when I was a little kid, my parents and their brothers and sisters would ship us all to Florida, to my grandparents' house. Oh, I wish I had that opportunity. But they would ship us off to Florida, and so we were usually, in Florida for the 4th of July. And there was a huge celebration in downtown Winter Park, Florida, across the railroad tracks from where my grandparents' house was. And you could occasionally see some of the fireworks going off, but we never went. And why didn't we go? Well, my grandparents were never allowed to cross the tracks after dark. A sundown town. So what ends up happening is that, again, the side of town that we were on, that's where the celebration occurred. Big cookouts, block parties. We made our own sprinklers out of Brillo pads, iron coat hangers, and I mean, it's stuff like that that was a part of our growing up. So my point is, and as you will hear from my colleagues, is that we have to understand that there are traditions and things that are happening in communities that most in this room may not be aware of. And they are no less valid, but if you really want to talk about inclusion, if you really want to talk about this commemoration being one for everyone, then you have to acknowledge and you have to go to those communities and find out what they are and celebrate and elevate those as well. Because if you're not, then we're not reaching our goal, right? We're not accomplishing our goal. So, with all of that as sort of our preamble to this discussion, let's jump right in. Because, like I said, each of you had a similar kind of story to tell. So I'm going to actually start with you,
Oh,
Noelle.
goodness.
Yeah, I want to start with you in talking about Boston communities and what's happening in Boston, because you came to Common Cause last year. You've been thinking very deeply about all of this. So let's talk about it.
Well, let's see. For those of you who were here last year, I represented a different state. I was in Tennessee. I still love Tennessee, but I moved. And so I've been in Boston for about 9 months. And I was born there, so I have some connection there. And one of the things that I have found very frustrating in the conversation is when I tell people where I'm working, people of all backgrounds say, there were Black people in Boston? And I was like, yes, forever, hundreds of years, lots of stories. But that shows you that people don't think about Boston as having this rich Black community. Mm-hmm. And my institution represents the free Black community that lived on the north side of Beacon Hill. And in 1806, they built their own church. And so they formed their church in Faneuil Hall in 1805, right? Our site on Nantucket includes a home built by Seneca Boston, who was a formerly enslaved weaver, built his home in 1774. But when you think about Nantucket today, you don't think about there being a thriving Black community of formerly enslaved people and sailors and whalers in Nantucket. It just doesn't gel with the public image. And so that's one of the things. And I will say the commission, and I serve on 2 commissions, the state and the city commission, there have been some really compelling conversations about what does this look like, especially for the city of Boston, because there's so many diverse populations. And one of the things I think is important that has been really great in the discussion is that there's been a lot of who else isn't here, right? And perhaps we need to consider some different things. So I think when we were doing our pre-con call, I said, one of the things that struck me in a meeting was Boston is very excited about the tall ships. And I was like, okay, so tall ships are coming. I don't understand the big deal, but it's a fascination in New England. People are super excited. They're like, tall ships are coming. It's great. And I'm like, okay. It's a ship. It comes, it's docks. Y'all have those every day. What's the big deal? That's me. I'm just not fascinated by boats. That's just my thing. But an indigenous member of the commission said, "Yeah, I need to point something out to you. Tall ships is not a celebration for my community. So when we're considering this, perhaps we need to consider what that means." And then I sat there and I was like, yeah, I could see that. But it never occurred to me that the symbolism that got excited for me that I felt fairly apathetic about was incredibly traumatizing to somebody. So that's not to say that tall ships doesn't come, right? But when tall ships arrive, do we give the indigenous community an opportunity to tell their story without us putting a spin on it? That means that we just let it lie. We don't have to say, oh, well, my people came on ships and we were not. No, that's not the time for that. This is their moment to own. Can we allow them to do it and share it in a way that feels authentic to them, right? We should not prescribe to people and to communities how that telling of their story should look. Because there are traditions, there are rituals that have happened in those communities that are done to honor those stories.
Thank you. Do you have anything you want to add?
I come from a very interesting community. I work for Prince George's County, Maryland. It was, up until like last year, the wealthiest black county in the US, if not the world. And but between 1776 and 1865, Prince George's County was the largest enslaving county in, I would say the region, but in Maryland, but we held more people enslaved than our neighbors in Northern Virginia. And now we're we're the second wealthiest black county in the United States. However, a large portion of our community are Latinos and Asians. We're predominantly people of color, the global majority in our county. However, our commission was founded something like 80 years ago. And our historic sites, we have about 10 sites under this history side of Parks and Planning. The majority of those are sites of enslavement, ranging from the 17th century through the 19th century, including Mary Surratt's Tavern, where the Lincoln Conspiracy was plotted. And for the majority of those 80 years, up until about 4 years ago, our sites operate as their own little fiefdoms. Even though our county is majority people of the global majority, our sites were run by white people. They didn't tell an inclusive story. They didn't tell stories that were relevant to the black community, not even to the majority Latino communities in their areas. And for that, the county continuously slashed funding. They're like, well, y'all don't get visitation, we don't give you money. And we're like, well, we don't do gingerbread house things, and we want to tell the story of decorative arts. And they weren't getting the visitation. And so it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You don't do things that reflect your community, the community doesn't come, hence you don't get money. Then like, well, why we can't hire more people? We can't do more programming because you're not working with your community. And so about 4 years ago, my position was created to do community outreach. And that's all I do, is go out to the community, and I have to listen to people on a daily basis, talk about how my sites suck. And I agree with them. And we laugh, but no offense, probably most of our sites suck. Because most of us aren't going out into the community and being like, you know what? On my day off, I'm gonna spend time in those communities that I don't know. I'm gonna go to a black church on a Wednesday night after I get off work. I'm gonna learn about a different culture. Noelle talked about the Native communities. Most of us probably haven't spent time on a reservation, an extensive time on a reservation, getting to know Native people. Most of us don't spend time outside of our comfort zones. We clock out at 5 o'clock and we go home to our families. And so for me, it's about that community outreach, about, yeah, you may get to work at 8, 9 o'clock, but sometimes you're not gonna get off until 11 o'clock because you have a veterans meeting with some black veterans or Native veterans or Asian veterans. And so how can we get out of our museums? I tell people, don't come to my sites. I wanna come to you. And so that's how I prescribe getting people into your museums, telling them don't come to Colonial Williamsburg, don't go to Mount Vernon, don't come to Prince George's County Parks, but what can my site do for you? Because we've already been celebrating Juneteenth. Come to my site to celebrate Juneteenth. Come to my site to celebrate Women's History Month. Come to my site to celebrate Black History Month. But we have to dispel ourselves of that and actually get into the communities and find out how we can give back.
Ashley.
Yes, so here comes Philadelphia.
Here comes Philadelphia.
And thank you, Stephen. Because Philadelphia is a special place. But one of the things that I can say about Philadelphia, particularly the work that we're doing there at the African American Museum in Philadelphia, we were founded during the bicentennial in 1976. And at that time, there were only 2 other African American institutions in the country. It was the Sabo in Chicago and the Charles Wright in Detroit. And now we look at today, there's over 300 sites dedicated to African American history and culture, whether it be wayfinder signs, monuments, and things of that nature. And I think it's important to note that in 1976, as we get ready to celebrate the 250th anniversary, we've come a long way, but like my colleagues have said, there needs to be a level of intentionality about how we connect with these sites, because our voices and the uniqueness of each site needs to be celebrated for just that. The fact that I know in Philadelphia, we're the repository for museums and studies, but there's the Marian Anderson House. And how do we show a connection for the Marian Anderson House? Or how do we show a connection for Paul Robeson or for Color Girls? And I know with my platform, I have an obligation to make sure that these sites aren't forgotten within the conversations. And I do think Philadelphia, we're doing the work now. I know we have people here like Stephen from the Revolutionary Museum. Cassandra Coleman is our local affiliate for the 250 Project. Just being intentional. Like these leaders, I know we keep saying about intentionality and connectivity and connections, but it really does matter. Like when I first moved to Philly, coming from Ohio, we feel like Ohio was overlooked in this conversation of freedom, because Ohio has the Underground Railroad. And then we also had 2 institutions dedicated to graduate studies or college studies. We had Wilberforce, the first privately owned institution for studies for African Americans. And then you had Oberlin College, which was the first school to admit, or at least put within their admittance records, that no student would be barred based on their color going back to the 1830s. And then so on, we've had workforce and things of that great nature. But then when the 60s come, Cleveland was the first city to elect an African American to the highest office of mayor, which was Carl Stokes. So I do think that this 250th anniversary gives an opportunity for other sites to come forward to tell their stories about how they're an extension of the legacy. Because I know people think of Philly, but then in the history landscape, people can also say Harlem, and they can say Chicago, and they can say Detroit, and then for us, our neighbors is Pittsburgh. So they could say we're well positioned too, but I really do feel like this is a time for other cities to come forward to make sure that their African American stories are not forgotten in this celebration.
I think that raises a really interesting point, and one that that we talked about before, and that is the idea of expanding on 1776, because excuse me, there are two elements to that. We have an opportunity to help communities learn names of other names within the founding generation, like a Salem Poor, right? Who's at Bunker Hill. We talked about Bunker Hill yesterday. His name was never mentioned, right? Or the Rhode Island Regiment, an all-black unit of Continental Army soldiers that would be here at Yorktown. All right, we don't talk, there are some places that talk about Crispus Attucks as the first one to die for liberty, right? And the founding generation venerated him. We don't talk about him. And that's sort of the point. We have these names. Ona Judge, right? Who is fighting for liberty her whole life, basically. Y'all know who she is? Good. Do you know who William Washington is? Well, y'all are from there. Don't skew. I know we have some DMO folks in the room too. So, this is a group of, I think it was 11. Correct me if I'm wrong. I know you're in the room, Doug, and others. I think there was a group of 11 of George Washington's enslaved people who chose to leave with the British, who chose to side with them because of the offer of freedom. And not only do they do that, but they are eventually end up in Nova Scotia and then become founders themselves of the colonies in Sierra Leone. And these are important American stories. So we have to be very careful, I think, as we're thinking about this, to include and make sure that we are including, again, all of these voices. We can say it all day long, but even in the course of our discussions here, we're hearing the same narrative essentially repeated with a few sprinkles. I'm sure, with all great intention, that we also have amongst our varying commissions. I'm curious, how many of the varying commissions in communities have actually reached out to institutions that are maybe of indigenous origin or African American communities beyond a special advisory committee, that they are actually on the core group, these institutions? And that's a question to ask, because it then feels additive versus meant to be core at the beginning of the work. And communities respond to that. They like, you want me now, but you haven't engaged me all along. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So as we talked about that, it gave us an opportunity to think deeper. We all talked about how to, where the opportunity is the expansion, right? It's going not only looking specifically at 1776 and getting those voices equally elevated, but also going beyond as we think about community. So what could that look like? How do you touched on it a little bit here, Ashley, when you talked about Pittsburgh and all that sort of thing. How do we get, say, the person in Phoenix who says, oh, we're in one of the original 13 colonies, why would we care? It's predominantly a Latino, indigenous communities out there. What it means something different. So how would you even begin to include and incorporate and help folks understand this is us too, right?
I would say that there's a quote that I love, and I forgot the French historian, but he was asked, when did the French Revolution end? And he said, I'll let you know when it does. And we think about the American Revolution from 1776 until 1781, and that's it. I would argue every generation has been part of this revolutionary movement. The Civil War was a high watermark of the forgotten promises and the failures of the battles and the treaty and the outcome of the revolution or the War of Independence. The Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, the LGBTQA movement, this growth of American fascism that's going on currently in our day-to-day lives is all part of this American revolution that we're going through. We are all revolutionary. We're all revolutionaries, or we're living in revolutionary eras. And so I would say to that person in Phoenix, Arizona, who's like, we have no connection, what are those revolutionary ideals that the Chicano movement or Native movements have been pushing for? Because that is this idea of the American Revolution. Even though you may have been, your group may have been, your culture, your ethnic group may have been left out of those promises. Last night, the keynote speaker talked about this idea of all men being created equal, and that we have to reform our government if, in the Declaration, if our government becomes oppressive, if our government is not fitting the needs of the people. And every generation, people, good-meaning people, have been trying to push further and further and further to make that more perfect union. And so whether you're one of the original 13 or you're one of the 50 states, plus all of our colonies, our territories, we have been fighting, people have been fighting for that, to create that more perfect union. And so I think that's the way I would frame it, is how those people who fought for those very American ideals created that more perfect union for their state or their territory.
It's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, I was going to build off of what you said, because Coretta Scott King had a similar quote. She said, freedom isn't free. You have to earn it with every generation. And so we're in a unique moment where people will look back and say, what did we do to maintain and earn more, right? And so it's up for every community to think about that. What does that look like? There's a lot in New England, there's a lot of who was doing what in 1776, 1774, 1775, all the things we were embargoed here, you know, evacuation day was a holiday the other day. There's all these things, and we get very stuck. The danger is you can get stuck in the 18th century, and you don't think about the ideals and how they permeated, how they extended beyond, right? How people took it, how there were conversations. And there is international dialogue, and I say that not in terms of ideas coming over from Europe, but remember across this continent, you know, Arizona in the in 1700s was Spanish, right? So they're dealing with these ideals. There's these conversations. Spanish government's talking to the American government and the British colonies. So there's different ways that we can come into this. I think that the judge's metaphor of a tapestry was phenomenal. I didn't think about it like that. I've been thinking about it as a kaleidoscope, right? And so we have all these elements in the kaleidoscope, and you know, as a kid, you could shake it up and turn it, and shake it up again and turn it, and you would see something different. The elements are still there. It just looks different depending on your perspective. We should be leaning into the unique perspectives of our community and getting as many of those on the table in a genuine and intentional fashion.
There's something that all of you have touched on a little bit, and that is, and our speaker Rosie Rios last night made a comment about this. I was trying to find the research to which she was referring about how younger people have a very different perspective about all this, very different concepts around the value of democracy, and it got us, you know, it got me thinking, why is that? Is it because there's been some failure to that generation, or they're tired before they even get going? Or, I mean, you know what I'm saying? There's an interesting thing about the generational differences and approach to all of this. Who wants to touch on that?
Can I?
Oh, sure.
I'm probably one of the younger people or youngest people in the room. I'm not going to tell you my age, but I have mentees who are in college, who are Gen Z. A lot of them are disillusioned with politics. A lot of them are like, we're not going to vote this election. They hate our founders or the framers of the Constitution because they're like slavery. They come to our historic sites and they're like, you're venerating these people who were admitted assaulters and sexual abusers. Why would we do this? And a lot of the commentary is about I guess their grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, has failed them. It's easy when you're, and this is not to get into generation wars, but when you are a baby boomer or you are a Gen Xer and you had a relatively good economy, you inherited a lot. The economy's changed. I get this debate with my parents all the time. They're like, why don't you just do this and, you know, buy a house? And I'm like, with what money? Historic sites aren't paying. Like the increase, our economy has changed. Our mentality has not. CEOs and execs are making million times more than they were during the Rockefeller era. Corporate. Thank you. Yeah, sorry. Corporations.
Yeah, I was kind of leaning
Yeah, corporate. I apologize. Like, yeah, corporate leaders are making more than they were during the Rockefeller, during the Gilded Age. And so what hope do people have if that wealth, if that opportunity is being consolidated, and it's being consolidated more and more? We as historians should know this. And so what if people don't feel like they have an opportunity? They're going to resort to extremes. And so we're seeing that. We're seeing extreme polarization on the left, extreme polarization on the right. And as historians, it doesn't matter what time period we look at, I think the good period to look at is the 1930s, in Germany specifically. You had battles in the streets of leftist and people on the far right. And I'm not saying that we as Americans are going to get to that point. Hopefully we don't. But we can see, if we look at our history, what happens. We saw it in the 1840s and 50s here in the United States with what happens when slavery expands or doesn't expand. People took up arms because people want an economic opportunities. These are often younger people who are doing this. And it's easier when you're older to be like, you know what, I have my things. Why are you complaining? Just work hard. I did that, not understanding the stressors that come with younger generations. And I've gotten older, I've been like, oh, like we can moderate a little bit. But I understand my mentees, when they talk about their opportunities are not gonna be the opportunities I had. They're definitely not the opportunities my parents had, who are boomers. And so I think when people are saying democracy, they don't believe in democracy, I think they're feeling those stressors of the American dream that was promised is not one that every generation gets to partake in, and especially if you're Native, if you're Black, if you're Latino.
Which is interesting. So just a few minutes ago, we said, or it was said that the key opportunity is to help focus in on those moments since 1776 where communities have stood together to move towards a more perfect union. And so what we're seeing, in fact, and to suggest that there aren't any, I think is a mistake. There are absolutely social movements and political movements that young people have engaged in to push for this, right? And to say, wait a minute, no, we don't want to go backwards. This is, I have Gen Z kids, right? I have Gen Z kids, I'm an Xer, right? And so the interesting thing to me is, and I have similar conversations with them, which is weird given how they grew up with history all around them, but there's a frustration, admittedly. But getting them, talking to my own kids about, well, it's not just about 1776. And so if we're able to elevate those key social movements and political movements that did expand, I think that begins to address, and it shows the empowerment. And here's the other thing that's interesting, is that all of the major movements have been led by young people, even the revolution. Think about it. Jefferson was 33 years old when he writes the Declaration of Independence. Other members that were in Philadelphia were in their 20s as well. The majority were young people, not older people, that changed the course of the world. So how do we help our young people understand that they have that power too? This is all a part of the conversation that we're having about diverse communities, growing diverse communities around this story, and those underserved communities. Because underserved can take on a whole set of meanings. And I think it's helpful for us to think through this in terms of intersectionality, because we tend to just think black or white, or we tend to think rich or poor, or whatever that particular binary we're choosing in the moment. But the fact is, each of us has a multiplicity of identity. The question becomes, how do we create experiences and participate and go into communities and invite communities genuinely in on this conversation? What would it look like if our 250th is, maybe it's about, I don't know, let's think.
Revolutionary ideas. And
Yeah.
I think that's what we lean into. I think one of the things that you said is, how do we make the younger generation understand? I don't think that's the right mentality for us to go into. Because when you go into that, you're assuming that your perspective is the one that needs to go forward.
Right.
And so the better way is to think of a dialogic model for that, right? One of the things that frustrates me about our field, and I love us, we're a bunch of wonderful history nerds, and we can go in on something like, you put a chair that allegedly Washington or Jefferson sat in, we'll talk about the chair, we'll talk about the paint, we'll talk about the individuals, we'll talk about where it was found, and everything like that. And that may not excite people, right? It excites me, but it doesn't excite anybody else.
Long ships.
Right. Tall ships. It excites
Tall
some people.
ships.
It doesn't excite everybody. But we're also really hesitant about technology, and to be quite honest, we're quite behind, right? And I know some of you are really excited about the new digital virtual tour that you have spent a lot of money in, but I gotta be honest, have you seen Fortnite? Have you
Right.
seen Grand Theft Auto? Have you seen, what are the other ones? Any of those video games. Like, part of our issue is we think our competition is books and documents. Our competition is how these kids consume information, right? Your competition isn't another museum. Your competition is what's on their feed, right? Your competition is how they play video games. So you can have a great tour model, but can your tour model pull someone off of Fortnite? Is it as engaging? You're like, oh, we've got great Object 360. I don't want to take away any of that from anybody. I know you fought long and hard to get somebody to pay you that money so you could photograph objects and do the wonderful modeling and engagement. But if we are going to really revolutionize and encourage them to think differently about something, we've got to step up our game. And when we look at the movements that we admire, it's when people stepped into using the technology differently that we've seen great change. So my previous gig, I did a lot of work in the civil rights movement, and they leveraged television well. I mean, they really did leverage television well to their advantage to change hearts and minds. What is this generation doing? They're doing it on Instagram.
TikTok, you're a little bit old, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna get to TikTok, but it's a little complicated. I know you're
Right.
on TikTok. They're doing it on TikTok. He is, you can follow him. They're doing it on TikTok. You know, they're doing it on Snapchat or whatever else is coming. And they're having very powerful conversations. You know, March for Our Lives kids are now young adults, and they have not stopped putting out stuff. Yolanda Renee King, Dr. King's granddaughter, has not stopped putting out information. In fact, she's more stepping into her own. And so I think part of our issue is we have to really step up. But it's not we got to make you understand the Declaration of Independence. What if we bring the Declaration of Independence alive, right? And what if we genuinely present an opportunity for this younger generation to present their perspective and not harshly judge them? Now, I know we got a bunch of historians in here, and we're a group of judgy people. I mean, that's what we're paid to do. We judge it all, right? Can we stop and allow them to interpret it differently? One of the most powerful things I've ever done in my career was an oratorical contest where we had students read excerpts of Frederick Douglass's speech. They memorized them and they presented them. The most unique ones, and probably some of the best ones, were English as a second language speakers. Now, you could criticize them for their pronunciation, but what they saw and how they interpreted their words, their rhythm of speaking it, sounded differently. And for the first time, I heard words that I've known very well, completely different. What if we allow these English as a second language speakers to get up and say excerpts of Patrick Henry's speech next year, right? Maybe they say it in their native language, right? What happens if we stop the judgment and say, can you express your meaning of freedom in a way that's authentic to you? I think we would find something extremely compelling.
That's a great idea.
Real-
Great.
Real quick about social media, like your sites should be on TikTok and Instagram, and not just about look at this object, but trying to find engaging ways to tell those stories. People like history, young people like history. It's just making it engaging. They don't want to be like, this object is important because it's George Washington's chair. And the mobile museum that I developed, we use all augmented and virtual reality to bring history to life, and we bring it to students for free. We travel around Prince George's County, they get to put on the Oculus goggles, and they have those discussions. We highlight a free black woman in Bladensburg, Maryland, who owned a tavern. George Washington went there, Charles Wilson Peale went there, and she also participated in the economics of the time. She was an enslaver. And high schoolers debate, what does this mean? We don't have an image of what she looks like. And they're like, could she pass for white? We talk about colorism, featureism. Black people enslaving people. Can you be a target of oppression and participate in oppression? And young people are, and we're not saying she is wrong, George Washington is wrong. Hey, would it be different if she was a white woman? And how would you think about that? And having kids really debate each other, and we just facilitate the conversation. What is this? What is that? And students are responding extremely well. And if you don't have that kind of money, again, Instagram is free, TikTok is free, Snapchat is free.
Do you have anything to add, Ashley? Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think last night was a good example when we had our dinner conversation with Thomas Jefferson. And for me, I would say a young person. But what if we would have had James Fortin in that conversation last night? Mm-hmm. Or if we heard from Phyllis Whitley, or even the Native American perspective? Because at this time, Thomas Jefferson's, doing his work, but there's other people doing their work too. Mm-hmm. And that would have resonated for me. But then the part that really hit home for me was when he said, you'll get the government you deserve. This celebration 250, what we put in it, you'll get what you deserve. So if it doesn't have diverse voices, if it doesn't have young people, and you're like, oh, how did we come short? It's because you didn't put in what you deserve to get. So I feel like everyone here is given the examples that need to happen. For us at the museum, we have college students doing our social media handles. They're into all those trends. They add all those emojis. They make history relatable to each other. It's been helpful because the way in which our analytics have grown, they understand all those things. The message of the museum is changing. I know we collect history, but we have to be a place where history happens. One of the things I took a while back, we had a chance to have a conversation with Bobby Seale, and he was saying how the success of the organization was that they were providing community services. I think museums, if we're serving communities, we have to provide those social services that provide them the buy-in to come to our places. So making sure that we have conversations that speak to their realities. We know in Philadelphia we're plagued with gun violence. We have issues with maternal health. The 250th celebration for us looks different because we're tackling new issues within our community.
Well, here's a good question then. This is what your institution is doing. Is that, and I'm not putting Pennsylvania on the spot, I'm just curious, does the Philadelphia Commission as well as the Pennsylvania Commission, are they embracing these kinds of ideas with institutions like yours?
Yes, I would say yes. Only because we know in 1976, we also had a mayor at that time who was legendary, Mayor Rizzo, unfortunately for some of his racist practices. And we know that Philadelphia is on a journey to correct itself, to make sure that our next celebration, we just elected our first female African-American to the highest office, which is, we had 99 men. We finally got our first female. So, yes, Mayor Parker is doing the great work. So we got an agenda from the state with Governor Shapiro to our city official, which is with Mayor Parker, our nonprofit affiliates here, and the commission over there. Like, we're coming together because we want to make this better. Like, it's just that level of intentionality that we have, and we just want to see things differently.
Okay, as we begin to wrap up with our 3 minutes and 36 seconds and counting, first, thank you. And then second, closing thoughts that each of you may have. Ashley, you start.
Well, I just want to touch back on last night's conversation. We're going to get the celebration that we deserve if we don't put in the right necessary voices and viewpoints. And my voice is going away, so I'm going to stop now. But, you guys got it.
Marvin.
Community, community, community. If you're not in the community, you're not doing it right. And we just have historic sites that could be used as housing because there's a housing shortage. So what are we, there is. It is what it is.
Right.
So what are we doing to get into the communities? And to remember that the revolution didn't end when the gunshots ended in the 18th century. And I want to leave you all with a quote from a man who was born enslaved, named William Grimes. For those from North Carolina, you should know him. I think he died in Connecticut, so if anyone from Connecticut, you should also know him. He wrote a book, and he said, kind of what I think really encapsulates this idea of America. He said, if it were not for the stripes on my back, which were made while I was a slave, I would, in my will, leave my skin as a legacy to the government, desiring that it might be taken off and made into parchment. Let the skin of an American slave bind the charter of a glorious, happy, and free America. And so when I think about this idea of community, what are those stripes on the backs of those people, those freedom fighters, from those native people who resisted European colonization, all the way to the people who are marching in the streets for a free Palestine, for Black Lives Matter, to end gun violence? What are those things that are pushing for a more equitable and free, not just United States, but a world where all people can be free?
Well, I don't have a quote. Here's what I'll say. I love this field. I love the work that we do. I find what we do, whether it's in Idaho, shout out to Jan Gallimore, to Tennessee, to Massachusetts. I think what we do is incredibly important. My hope for all of you is to go back to your communities and figure out a way to have a meaningful relationship with your diverse and underserved communities, to create opportunities for storytelling that move beyond the dominant narrative and allow people to show up to the 250th in a way that's authentic and meaningful for them, because it will benefit us all in the long run. It'll enrich the tapestry that Judge Thomas described for us the other day, and it will all be better for it. We have a lot of work to do, but I believe the people in this room can execute it and execute it well. And hopefully any corporate people who are seeing this will send us all some money.
And on that note,
Before you take your final bow on this one,
yes, sir.
I would have had to say no when you posed those names, had we heard of them. And I'm not ashamed that I didn't know them. I'm appalled that I wasn't taught. We learned what we were taught. And you further underscore what we've been saying forever, people of color. That history's been held hostage. Today is the day to ransom that history.
Well said. Well said. And on that, I thank you all so much. Our next event is at 10 o'clock, so you have about, I guess 10 minutes before the next presentation. If you would like to ask questions of the panel, by all means, we'll be right over here on the side if you have a particular interest, need, question that you want to address. Thank you all so much.
Christy.
Christy.